We've got over, I think, 100 people online now, so we might kick off the meeting, which we've got quite a bit to get through today, and we're going to try and get through most of the content in about half an hour to allow people to get back to work and to their lunch break. And in terms of this process, we will be talking at the end about where to next in terms of the major reform processes that are currently being undertaken by the public sector, and we'll also try and provide information to people after today's session, both in terms of an opportunity to ask questions by email, but also particularly in relation to determining the union's priorities about where we move to next. There'll be some communications coming out over the next couple of days. So today is the first time we've attempted this sort of industrial briefing in a post-COVID environment using the Zoom technology. So we apologise in advance for any technical glitches that may happen. Given the number of people online, we've been overwhelmed by the response from the request for today's meeting. We are putting people on mute, so therefore, given with the numbers involved, it'd be impossible to have a meaningful conversation over this process. So basically today will be a presentation format, and we are going to be trying to monitor the chat, but primarily we'll be then sending out an email this afternoon for everybody who attended or registered to attend to give you an opportunity to seek further questions or clarification. And then tomorrow there will be an email going out to union members to talk about some of the key decisions that we need to make moving forward in relation to the change processes occurring within the public sector more broadly. So I would try to make this presentation as user-friendly as possible, but I apologise if some of it is a bit complicated at times. So in terms of that process, what we really wanted to talk about was three major issues in terms of the public sector at the moment, one being about public sector wages, one being in relation to the proposals about what's happening with the Queensland state budget, and the third being in relation to the major legislative reform process that has been commenced in relation to the Public Service Act and associated directives from the Public Service Commission. So we want to run through those. That's not necessarily in order of importance, but we wanted to talk more at the end in relation to the Public Service Act and what that looks like, because that's clearly an issue where the union members need to make a number of decisions over the next couple of weeks. So that was where we want to end the presentation. In terms of that process, in terms of the public service wages issue, there has been a lot of happening in this space in recent times, and we wanted to talk that through with people. This presentation is designed primarily for people covered by the core public service agreement or the education or child safety agreements, and some of the smaller public sector agreements that are associated with those. That's a group of workers who are primarily having their wages based on the award at the moment. So the state government introduced legislation in June, which sought to freeze the wages for those workers through the collective bargaining process. And as part of that process, basically wages that were due as part of collective bargaining outcomes were frozen from 1 July this year to 30 June next year, and then they had those wages were effectively deferred to a kind of 18 months later into that process. So most of those public sector agreements, rather than having a pay rise on the 1st of July, pay rise on the last year, pay rise on the 1st of July this year, and a pay rise on the 1st of July the year after, have a pay rise on the 1st of July last year, nothing on the 1st of July this year, and then one on the 1st of July the year in 21, and then the 1st of January 22, they have the 2.5% from this year gets effectively moved for 18 months in that process. So that's basically what's happened to most public sector wages across the board. There's been some variations about the timing of that because of the different times of different legislation, different collective bargaining agreements. But that's basically what's happened to school teachers and police officers and a range of together members within the Queensland health area. And that's meant that they've effectively had a pay deferral of 18 months as a result of that legislation. But what that means in terms of the core is different, and for most public servants covered by the core government departments, because of what happened to wages in 2012, your award is now higher than your EB. So you have two industrial instruments to cover you. You have your public service award as well as your core EB, or there's a couple of other variations that the child safety in schools of EB now. But basically that in both industrial agreements, instruments have a wage rate, and they are different wage rates. Traditionally, in every other part of the sector and in the private sector, what you have is that the award is the minimum, and then you have well above that, you have your EB rates. And so you only have to look at your collective bargaining agreement to work out what your wages are, because that's what actually is the thing that changes the money in your pocket. What's happened because of what happened in 2012 with the wages freeze under Campbell-Newman and the failure to be able to get a collective bargaining agreement in 2012, over a period of time, progressively, for public servants, the award started to become the thing that determined your wage increases. So it happened for most of 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015. We got a pay increase that took you above the award with a one-off payment, but the pay increases in that collective bargaining agreement got slowly caught up by the award increases because they were different amounts. And then in 2018, we had the situation where most public servants, their award rates were higher than their collective bargaining rates. So you looked at what you were getting paid. If you looked at the EB, that will give you a figure that was actually less than what we were taking home in your take-home pay each fortnight, and it was actually the award that was going to be in place. That's been the case for public servants in 2018. We failed to get a collective bargaining agreement in 2018 because of the fundamental dispute between ourselves and the government. The government was offering 2.5% on your previously expired EB rates, which actually meant you weren't getting a pay rise at all, where we were arguing that the pay rise should have been based on the actual amount of money you were getting paid at the time. So bargaining failed during that period, and we ended back in arbitration. And then last year, we were able to negotiate as part of the $12.50 one-off payment. We were able to negotiate to get out of bargaining, out of the arbitration process and into bargaining, but we agreed to disagree on the issue of wages. So in terms of that process, your wages are still set by your award. And in terms of that process, you got a wage increase last year. In 2018, you got 3.75, and last year you got 3%, because that's what came out of the state wage case that reflected the national wage case. This year, the wage freeze legislation that was passed by the government affected collective bargaining processes, but not the award process. So this year we are still making an application for the state wage case that would affect the wages for public servants. That reflects the national wage case normally and has over the last 10 years. So we've made an application for a 1.75% increase for public servants from the 1st of September through the state wage case process. So that application has been held, is in the Commission, Industrial Relations Commission at the moment, and we would expect that those hearings are going to be called over the next couple of weeks into August. And we are confident that, as we have over every year in the last decade, that we will be able to win that case in the Industrial Relations Commission, which would mean that the state wage case will move the public service award, and that will mean that you get a 1.75% increase on your award. We should get a 1.75% increase on your wages come the 1st of September, despite the legislation that was passed in relation to the wage deferral process for those workers who had collective bargaining agreements above the award. So the safety net minimum we've made the application to increase it, and we're confident that will happen on the 1st of September, will happen before the 1st of September, and will be operative from the 1st of September for a 1.75% increase. As I said before, we also at that point in time, we had the collective bargaining process that we failed to get a negotiated outcome in 2018. We then moved to arbitration, and then we had a vote earlier this year to move out of arbitration, which gave us the payment of $12.50 before tax, and set a process to have the Industrial Relations Commission resolve the thing that we couldn't resolve. And that really was where we should be at with public sector wages in relation for the public servants, about what the relativity should be, particularly when we had health and transport and main roads workers getting paid more than public servants for effectively doing the same job. And because of that bargaining structure, they have moved further ahead, and their agreements are ahead of the award. So in terms of that, they're caught by the deferral process, but the process that we negotiated at the beginning of this year was that everything else will be resolved. We would have a collective agreement. It would run until 2023, But the question of what to do about wages in terms of how much more than the award should you get, and where the 2.5% should apply, was subject to a process whereby there was the agreement establishes a process whereby there can be an arbitration by the Industrial Relations Commission just on the question of wages. And that process is continuing. So irrespective of the wage deferral process, you will get a state wage case outcome almost certainly on the 1st of September this year. And secondly, after that process, then there will be another process, secondary process, that will arbitrate through the Industrial Relations Commission the question of whether or not, what the relativity between the award and the EB should be for public servants. So in terms of that process and the collective agreement, there are some negotiations that are currently going on with government, and with those occurring. If they fail to come up with an acceptable outcome, we will then see a secondary process in the Industrial Relations Commission later this year, sometime after the state wage case, that will potentially provide a secondary wage outcome for you, and will also then set your wages above the award for the next 3 years. The EB doesn't give any guarantees about what quantum that would be, but it does say that they will apply from the 1st of September each year. So in terms of that, in terms of wages, the wage freeze deferral legislation doesn't capture the core public servants because you're on the award. Because you're on the award, you should almost certainly get a 1.75% increase on the 1st of September. And thirdly, because of the structure within your collective agreement, there will be a set of negotiations. If they fail, there will be a process whereby the Industrial Relations Commission will arbitrate about whether you should get paid more than the award, and how much, if so, how much more you should get paid for more from the award, which then may mean there'll be a backdated pay increase from the 1st of September this year, and future increases on the 1st of September next year, and the year after, and the year after that. So that is a bit complicated, but the overall message is there won't be a wage freeze for public servants. That means you'll get a pay rise this year on the 1st of September, probably of 1.75%. You won't then have the catch-up process that occurs in the other collective agreements, but there will be a separate determination process in addition to the 1.75 state wage case that should apply to you sometime after the 1st of September, with backdating to the 1st of September. So I apologise if that's complicated, but the public service wages process is an ongoing process. We will continue to report back to you about how the negotiations with government go for the questions about wages above the award, and we'll try and report that back to you in the next fortnight, depending on how those negotiations go, and then look at what happens in terms of any arbitration process if required. The other second major issue we want to talk about briefly was the changes occurring in relation to the public sector as a result of the state budget process. Clearly, we've seen a significant impact on the Queensland and Australian economy as a result of COVID and the resulting lockdown of the economy that occurred since March. And we know that has resulted in two things. One is a collapse of the state government revenue, and which kind of drove the question about the wage deferral legislation. And we've got a kind of the juxtapositioning at the moment of significant expenditure by the state government in relation to economic stimulus, while at the same time looking at a significant deficit this year, and potentially a larger deficits into future years because of the slowing down of the economy has a dramatic impact in relation to the income for the state government, both through its own royalties and taxes, but also through its share of the goods and services tax. So we've seen the state budget that was due in May be deferred. There will be, as we understand it, an economic statement prior to the state election, which will provide an outline in relation to where the accounts are at prior to the state election. We are expecting some sort of economic statement from the Commonwealth government sooner rather than later as well. We would expect that once we get to see the size and scale of the federal government deficit and some of its assumptions about future economic growth, we would then be able to see something similar from the state government, but certainly would expect to see that before September. So we're in a bit of a never land in terms of the state public sector, in that we know there is a significant financial crunch occurring in relation to the future of the state public sector and what that's going to mean for agency budgets. but we haven't seen the full detail of that yet because we haven't seen a full state budget. So at one level, we are seeing significant attempts by agencies to manage, while they don't have a budget for this financial year yet, there is an expectation from government agencies that they are going to be facing cuts and contractions sooner rather than later in relation to prior to the state election as that economic statement occurs, but there's no actual numbers around it. So we are seeing some, and we've also seen some statements from the previous Treasurer, Minister Trad, in relation to a freeze on recruitment and a range of other statements that were made. One of those came to fruition in relation to the wages freeze, but there was no clarity around what the recruitment freeze looked like. And then we had a change of Treasurer after that, kind of given the CCC investigation and Minister Trad stepping down, and then Minister Dick became the new Treasurer. And there was in terms of that process, there's been less statements, but there has been one significant statement made by the Treasurer where he kind of gave the press conference in relation to the value of the dollar, and in conjunction with that press statement, there was an announcement about a series of public sector reforms and savings packages that were being implemented by the state government. And some of those are challenging to understand, but we were hoping to have full details for you today, but we've got a briefing at 2 o'clock, unfortunately, with the Under-Treasurer and the Director-General of Premiers and the Public Service Commissioner to get a better understanding of exactly what is being proposed by the state government in terms of those announcements. But they do go to, as best as we can understand it at the moment, there are a suite of issues. One of those is around the question of contractors and consultants and annual reports and some of those other things we've seen reasonably regularly announced. We've also seen some significant announcements in relation to the level of the size of the SES, Senior Executive Service, and that being affected by natural attrition. As best we can understand at the moment, the comment was that the frontline public service would continue to grow, but that the non-frontline public service wouldn't grow, but there was no specific suggestion it would contract either. But there was also a suggestion, or a commitment made that there would be that the process for filling vacancies would be through internal promotions rather than external advertising. So that's different to what's happening at an agency level, where basically agencies, particularly for groups they define as non-frontline in an arbitrary sense, there has certainly been some introductions at an agency level of kind of establishment controls in terms of non-filling of vacancies, kind of recruitment freezes, vacancy rate targets around 10%, and that varies from agency to agency. So there has been no clarity at this stage in relation to what the Treasurer has announced in terms of the sector-wide policy, as opposed to what's happening at the departmental level, at the agency level. But what we are looking at is trying to engage centrally with the three Directors General this afternoon, and hopefully we'll be able to provide you through an email tomorrow more clarity about what exactly is going on there. And I apologise we haven't got more detail. We were hoping that meeting was going to be occurring prior to today's briefing to you about the broader public sector stuff. So that's part of it. And the other significant element in relation to the announcement from Minister Dick was that that there would be a move to try and reduce the size of the rental bill, the accommodation costs within the CBD, and so there'd be some sort of longer term move towards public service hubs in the suburbs, which would primarily be being driven by hot desking in those arrangements. Clearly, that's a medium to longer term strategy, and what that looks like in terms of that's also not sustainable in a COVID environment with the health risks around hot desking. So what we are trying to negotiate with government at the moment is trying to get an understanding from government around what the medium term working from home arrangements look like in terms of the public service, given the COVID risks around public transport, but also and the ability to have internal recruitment rather than external recruitment for promotional positions. But secondly, we've been working with the branch executive and the delegates to try and work through what the claim looks like in terms of trying to provide a safe working environment for public servants who work in the broader CBD and also in regional Queensland, but making sure that where people are finding working from home the best way of delivering a safe workplace for them, but also delivering a quality service to the Queensland community, and also getting a work-life balance right, that to try and improve the work-life balance through greater access to a continuation of working from home arrangements rather than middle management being able to try and force public servants back to the status quo pre-COVID, because clearly the public sector and the workplace has changed as a result of COVID. COVID's not going away anytime soon without a vaccine. We've seen what's happening in Victoria. The best way to try and avoid a more substantial economic lockdown is to have safe public transport, to have safe workplaces, and to avoid risks wherever possible. And that means that has the potential where workers do find working from home a substantial improvement in terms of work-life balance, spending less time stuck in traffic jams or on buses and trains. That is something that we are trying to prosecute in conjunction with the Treasurer's statement in relation to the medium-term hubs, looking at the short-term opportunities for increased access to working from home arrangements. Once again, we thought we'd be able to provide you with more detail about that, but the meeting got shifted till 2 o'clock today, so we haven't got as far as we would have liked in terms of that process. Then the other major, so in terms of that process, we are really looking at through the impact on the recruitment of the state budget and what that looks like, particularly about the internal selection processes, working through the accommodation issues, particularly in terms of the CBD, but hopefully being able to have that as part of a broader argument about establishing more rights for workers to work from home, where they are able to provide better outcomes for the community, more efficient outcomes for the department, and a better work-life balance for workers. And also working through the challenges around having public transport in a COVID-safe environment. Clearly, there is less people on buses and trains at the moment, but we expect that as private sector employers start to ramp up their return to office environment, that there will be real challenges around that process. And while there's been some additional buses and trains announced by the state government in the last week, we're wanting to work through making sure that the people are able to have a safe environment in coming to work, but also making sure that they're not put in a situation where they have to miss the bus or train because it's too crowded by the time it gets to them if they're coming into the Brisbane CBD. So in terms of that, there'll be there's a meeting this afternoon at 2 o'clock, and we'll be able to hopefully report back some further details to delegates and members later this week as to exactly what has been proposed by the state government and what the implementation plan from the Public Service Commission and from Queensland Treasury looks like in terms of rolling that process out. But the other major change that's been occurring is in relation to the public sector legislation and the Public Service Act review. And so in terms of that process, Together has been campaigning for a number of years about the problems within the Public Service Act, but also generally about the treatment of public sector workers by middle management and senior management in a range of ways. So as part of that program, we were able to successfully lobby the government to undertake a review of the Public Service Act. And that was undertaken by Peter Bridgman, who had formerly been a consultant to the union, as a senior barrister who is an expert in this area, and a former long-term public servant who was able to undertake the Bridgman review to come up with fundamental reform in terms of the Public Service Act. That review was completed almost 2 years ago now, and in terms of that process, it got the review was completed. We had good submissions to the review, but the review itself was never released. So as part of the bargaining process and the move out of arbitration in December last year, we were able to negotiate with the government in relation to releasing the Bridgman review and then looking at a legislative program to try and reform the Public Service Act in a way that would deliver an outcome for workers through that change process. So originally, that commenced through a joint advisory committee process that Together was on to try and work through the very substantial changes that were being proposed by Bridgman in terms of a complete rewrite of the Public Service Act. In terms of that, that committee is being considered, and that process has now got to the stage it's being back to Cabinet, and there is now two prongs to the legislative reform program. One is about legislative reform and changes to the Public Service Act, and secondly, there is a tranche of work around consequential changes to directives. So you have a series of rights and entitlements in the Public Service Act, which is primary legislation. It also then creates the Public Service Commission and also provides the Public Service Commission to issue directives. What is being sought in terms of the Act changes is some of the work is being done through amendments, but also some of the work is being done through consequential changes to directives. At this point in time, we know what the amendments are to the Act. We have a commitment in relation to the timeframes for the directives, but we haven't seen those draft directives at this stage. So in terms of that process, the joint advice, the original position from government is that there was large-scale fundamental change to the nature of the sector as part of how departments operate and stuff, and that was too big to get done between January and the state election. So there's a bunch of the Bridgman reforms that have been pushed off until after the state election, but we were able to negotiate with government that some of the issues that most fundamentally affected workers' rights, as opposed to the structure of the sector, were able to be put into stage one, and that stage one would be implemented prior to the election. Initially, that was going to be done very much earlier in the year, and we were looking at legislation potentially being tabled in March and April, and then passed before July, to try and make sure that we didn't get caught up in the pre-election challenges in terms of as the public sector slows down often prior to a state election. But then COVID hit. But the original timeframe for consideration was based on a June kind of passing in legislation in June. What we've now got is a commitment about passing legislation it being tabled now. But the fundamental change is that meant that they were trying to rush a lot of the work. And in terms of the Joint Advisory Committee work, a lot of that was then saying, well, it's difficult to get everything done between January and March, and so therefore we will try and shift some of the improvements to workers' rights from legislation and put more into the directives. And that was really a broad part of the government's response to Bridgman was saying public sector workers are treated badly and we needed to change your rights at work to make sure you were treated more fairly. But the initial round of legislation is really quite limited. There are some significant changes, but there is also potentially a lot more of the rights that we'll be seeking, that work being done through the directives rather than the legislation itself. So in terms of some of the more significant reforms through the Act at this stage, is in relation to the temporary conversion process. We had significant reforms occurring in this over the last couple of years as a result of some IR, the Industrial Relations Act changes. We're able to negotiate to get some changes just in relation to temporary conversions for public servants in the Public Service Act. That was primarily done through improvements in the directive, but also some appeals processes. So the new Act does start to get into some changes, particularly around putting some of the criteria into legislation rather than directives. Secondly, there is some fundamental changes around how the appeals would work, because one of the challenges we've had in terms of improving members' lives is that we've been taking a number of appeals where departments have refused to convert temporary people to be permanent. We've taken those through the Public Service Commission Tribunal, and that has been providing inconsistent decisions. The Public Service Tribunal is the Industrial Relations Commission. The Commission is wearing a different hat under a different piece of legislation. The IR, the current changes proposed to the Public Service Act would not change the people hearing those appeals, but change the legislative basis for them, which would basically then make the tribunal's Industrial Commission outcomes, which then means they are set by President and are published. And so therefore we would hope that while it's a minor change at one level, it should provide much greater consistency of outcome and transparency of outcome, and then we will be able to get a greater process around that. There was also a recommendation from Bridgman that there be a 1-year review rather than an automatic 2-year review. So you'll still have a requirement to do a 2-year review at 2 years, and that can be appealable. Employees can ask for a review at 1 year, which is non-appealable. We're not sure if that's going to make as much difference, but there will be some significant changes there. In addition to that, there is also a number of heads of power being changed in the Act, but the details of that is being proposed to be done through directives. So particularly in relation to long-term high duties, when we had the reform around temporary employment, we were able to get a lot of long-term temporary employees made convert permanent. But we were having a situation where we have 4 or 5 AO5s, 3 of them were temporary, and they would get converted to permanent. 2 of them might have been AO2s acting as 5s, but there was no mechanism available to get them converted. So they had security of employment, but not security of income. So the people who had low security of employment were able to get converted to the old process, but there was a large tranche of public sector workers who are still on long-term hire duties, so who couldn't lose their job as easily as a temporary, but could potentially take a 50% pay cut if their hire duties was cut. So the Act does start to, actually for the first time, provide some substantial change in relation to having a mechanism for delivering the ability to convert long-term hire duties into permanent positions in the same way a temporary could be converted to a permanent position. There is some holes in that around the fact that it says you've got to have a merit process, which we think, so you can't be converted unless you went through a merit process. We think that's a good thing at one level. In the future, that you should do a merit process before you do hire duties. But there are a large number of workers and the union members across the board who are in long-term hire duties who never had a recruitment process to start with because they just weren't done at the time. So we need to make sure in terms of that process that those people don't miss out on that conversion process. There are also significant improvements being proposed in relation to making discipline covered by a directive, where at the moment there are only guidelines and they don't require departments to follow them. Significant changes in relation to improving the way investigations work, although I expect that most of those reforms will be occurred through the directives process, and reintroducing a process whereby there's more clarity around the ability to take grievances and fair treatment appeals for workers where there's bad decisions were being made, where that kind of process got substantially watered down when the complaints by customers got conflated into the grievance process for public sector employees and ended up with a significant watering down. There's also a large part of the legislative changes also dealing with what Brisbane referred to as positive performance management, which really looks at shifting the responsibility from the current Act is very negatively drafted, where the new Act is supposed to be more positively drafted, making it a employer responsibility to assist workers in professional development, whatever. I'm more cynical about whether that will actually have a practical implications for workers, but I think it's not a bad thing, but I'm not sure if it's going to be something that is really going to change the behaviour of employers. I think from my personal experience that employers are pretty good at avoiding the legislation in terms of where there's a lot of good things in the current Public Service Act about staff being treated appropriately, and quite clearly lots of agencies still treat staff really badly despite the legislation. So I'm worried that that particular reform may fall into the category of some nice parenthood statements in the Act that doesn't change workers' lives, where I think the long-term hire duties, the discipline, the investigations has real capacity to make some substantial difference to workers. So in terms of that process, that the amendments have been tabled in Parliament and they're now public on the parliamentary website. Submissions to that parliamentary committee are due next Thursday, the 30th. The union has got a branch executive meeting on that day, and we'll be finalising our submission at that point in time. And then there'll be parliamentary committee hearings in August, and there'll be a final parliamentary report, committee report in August, and then in September the Parliament will consider should consider the legislation in relation to both the draft amendment table and also any outcomes from the parliamentary committee process. So in terms of the process from Together's point of view, what we know in terms of our ability to campaign previously has been that while we've been able to lobby successfully for legislation to be passed, we've also been able to lobby successfully in the last two rounds of Industrial Relations Act amendments to amend legislation during this process. And while the Joint Advisory Committee particularly didn't provide for as much detail in the Act as we would have liked and said most of the grunt work should have been done through the directives, that made sense in January. It's now July, and so there is less reason to say that we need to have that balance right. And fundamentally, in terms of that process, what we want to try and do is get our submissions right and make sure that what your union says on your behalf to the committee reflects your interests. And particularly in relation to that, every worker has different interests. People with long-term hire duties compared to people who are temporary workers compared to people who are subject to investigations or a range of those issues. So we really need to hear from Together members as to what you want that submission to say. We have some views, but we also need to understand what the priorities are. So coming out of that with the state, the next week and a half will be about making sure your voice is heard within the union, and that really requires you to have a say about it. And once we've determined as a union what members want us to do, we'll then need to be talking to you about how do we then make the legislation the best legislation it can be, and particularly thinking about not just about whether we support or otherwise these amendments, but should these amendments go further? And really the question of thinking through what that looks like in terms of the process is then thinking about how do we campaign to at the committee level to improve the amendments and argue our case in front of the committee. And that's not just going to be about what is right, because we know that in terms of our ability to prosecute the argument, workers are being treated badly at the moment and the reform is needed. And even Bridgman said that, the Joint Advisory Committee said that. But what we need to do is, in terms of at a level of the committee is made up of members of parliament. We need to convince them at a political level that it is a good idea to support not just these current amendments, but to go further. And then making sure that if the committee does come down with recommendations that we support and that the legislation as a package will make a better life for workers, that we make sure it gets passed in September, because we are up against there's only 2 more sitting weeks before Parliament recesses for the election in October. So we need to get the amendments right. We need to get as good outcome out of that committee as possible. And then also make sure that as a government, the government takes these amendments seriously as a priority. We've been campaigning for years to get some of these legislation changes happening. People on long-term hard duties have been continually forgotten and bypassed in this legislative process before. We've argued the case. This is the first time we've been able to get the government's attention around long-term hard duties, and so we can't afford to lose that process. So in terms of that, we really need then a strong campaign to make sure legislation passed in the same way that we've been, as workers, been able to campaign for around previous changes to the Industrial Relations Act. So what we really need to be able to do in terms of that process is, after today, we'll be sending out an email this afternoon, we hope, to ask you for further clarification about the issues that I've talked about today. I accept this is not a perfect situation in terms of being able to cover all the issues that are important to you. So if things don't make sense to you, please email back today and talk about the questions that you've either found confusing in the way I presented them, or you want more detail. We can then craft those stuff both as a personal response to you, but also make sure the communications we send out to members tomorrow and Friday make sense to people, because they might make sense in my head, but we really need for public servants and union members to understand what is going on. So it's about what you hear, not about what I say. And then in terms of that process, we really then need for as many members as possible to consider what are the priorities for you in that submission process, to make sure that when the branch executive, which is made up of 20 rank and file union members from across the state, signs off on that submission next week, that submission reflects the issues that are important to you. So we're really going to be asking you over the next 10 days to take the time to have your say, because you might say, yes, those things are all good, but unless your voice is heard, we won't be reflecting the views of all members. So it's really important that as many members tell us what their views are in terms of that submission. That'll then provide us with the platform to argue the best case possible in relation to delivering an outcome that will make the most difference to the most number of members. And after that submission goes in, that's when we then need to move into the campaign phase to make sure that we do everything we can as a collective group of workers to influence the committee. And we've done that in the past. We know how to do that. When members get involved, when members speak up, when members are active, we are able to influence the committee process. And we'll be asking you and other workers across the sector to stand up and get involved and argue and prosecute your case with the politicians to make sure they listen. And the one advantage we've got this time is the election is close, and we know the closer the election, the more politicians will listen. So get as part of that process to make sure we deal with that, and then also once we get past the committee stage, we'll then want to talk to members across the board about how we then get that legislation passed. But as I said before, there are a couple of other things that are occurring at the same time as this, and particularly depending on how the discussions go about the budgetary process, we may be asking you to get involved in some other issues around what that looks like in terms of work from home, in relation to public transport, in relation to also the question about the freeze, the use of labour hire, contracts, consultants. That's going to be running concurrently with the campaign in relation to legislation. We don't know just as much about that yet. I hope to know more later this afternoon. If we do know more this afternoon, we'll send that out in the email tomorrow and Friday. But we'll probably also then reschedule another one of these Zooms meetings depending on member feedback to look at providing you with an update probably in 2 weeks' time, both about where we got to in terms of the union submission, talk about what that looks like then in terms of the next phase about the campaign and where we're at in terms of the broader legislative program, but hopefully be in a position to talk to you more about what the budgetary issues around the freeze, around the recruitment, the kind of internal selection process, and some of the other issues that are that were announced by the Treasurer, Mr. Dick, a couple of weeks ago. Clearly, they have significant potential impacts, as well as the agency-based freezes are occurring independently of government process around the state budget. So I apologise we don't have as much detail on that. So hopefully in 2 weeks' time we'll be able to give you more information, and we'd encourage you to out of today, please send questions to us when you get the email this afternoon, so we can both answer your questions, but it'll help us better craft the communications to the broader membership tomorrow and Friday. And then secondly, make sure you put when we ask you to support, give us your views in relation to what the union submission looked like. Please make sure your voice is heard in that process, but also try and encourage your fellow work colleagues, even if you're working at home or working back in the office at the moment, to get involved, because the strength of that submission will only be as good as the number of people who have their voice heard within the union. And then also to try and encourage people to come to future Zooms like this. If you found this satisfactory, if you want changes to it, we can do that. But we really want to try and improve the level of communication to members, because what we're finding, because of COVID, is a very different, things are happening very quickly. We are seeing a lot of changes being announced through the Courier Mail or by politicians around a range of issues. And this process we think is potentially more helpful, or at least complementary to our email strategy in terms of communication. But the speed of change also provides us with an opportunity to influence that change, but that change will only occur if more members are involved. And so while we've got an overwhelming response to today's meeting, we really want to try and give the opportunity for more members to get more involved in these campaigns over the next 2 months to maximise our chances of an outcome. So thanks everybody for taking the time today. Please provide feedback this afternoon when we send the email, either about questions you think need to be asked or comments about how we could structure this differently. And then thirdly, make sure that when we call for your views on what the submission should say, don't just assume everybody's going to say the same as you. Unless your voice is heard, our submission won't reflect what you as members, because every member has a different set of issues. Nobody is identical in terms of your concerns and your issues. And we need to make sure that as many people tell us what needs to go in that submission, so it reflects as much as possible all members' attitudes, issues and concerns, so that way we can take advantage of the opportunity over the next 2 months to make a real difference through your working lives. So I know we went a bit longer than I would have liked. I'm sorry I spoke so fast. Please ask the questions through the email this afternoon, and please give us any feedback about how we could do this better. But certainly we'll try and do this in a couple of weeks' time, and try and provide you with every opportunity to make sure your voice is heard and we can make a real difference to your working life. Thank you for your time.